Studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's June 23rd, 2015. A United Nations Commission releases its report on last summer's Israeli war on Gaza. We'll turn to Professor Jennifer Loewenstein to discuss it. And I'll speak with journalist Glenn Greenwald in the first in a series of interviews as part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. Plus, we'll hear commentary by Mumia Abu Jamal on the Charleston terror attack. And Dara Silverman joins us to discuss how white Americans can join in the struggle for racial justice. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Good morning, Sonali.
A staggering number of people are going hungry, quote unquote. Those are the words of Joyce Luma, the director of the World Food Program. She was talking to the New York Times about a crisis in the world's newest nation, South Sudan. Just 4 years ago, the Republic of South Sudan offered hope for peace when it split off from Sudan. But 2 years ago, fighting broke out between various groups, and there was a rise in unspeakable crimes, many aimed at women and children. Now more than 4 million people are at risk of starvation in the landlocked African nation. The World Food Program has struggled to send food to South Sudan, but aid workers have also been targeted by fighters. South Sudan has rich oil fields that are at the heart of a power struggle between various factions in the government. And to make matters worse, there's now a cholera outbreak reported in the capital, Juba, with 18 people dead and 170 confirmed to be infected. Bob, there's been very little coverage of this crisis in the media. Why?
Well, I think it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. If there's no direct effect on the United States, often we don't hear a lot of coverage. Of course, there is always an effect in the sense that we're moral agents. We're concerned about the fate of others around the world. Here, I think one of the things we should be focused on is the role of the United Nations. If there is a solution to this crisis, the United Nations and regional groupings around the world are going to be central to it. The United States has so thoroughly undermined the effectiveness and legitimacy of the United Nations for so long. I think it always comes back to our role. Even if we don't see where we can intervene in this crisis today beyond providing humanitarian aid, we can always come back and ask, how are we going to be more supportive of the potential of the United Nations in resolving these kinds of crises?
The group ActionAid has just released a new report about violence against women's rights activists internationally. Surveying nearly 50 activists from a number of countries, including Afghanistan, Nigeria, South Africa, Brazil, and the US, the report concluded that women are suffering more violence than before and that governments are not doing enough to protect them. Worse, often governments are themselves perpetrators of physical and verbal abuses. Most vulnerable are those working on abortion and LGBT rights. ActionAid has launched a campaign in the UK, where they are based, called Fearless, which calls for more funding and better enforcement of human rights standards. According to the Guardian newspaper, quote, the mobilization of women's rights organizations was the most important factor in turning commitments to end violence into meaningful action, having more impact than the number of women in parliament or the wealth of a country. Bob, one of the main reasons for this rise in violence, according to the report, is simply a lack of funding. Is the story one ultimately about capitalism and wealth inequality?
No, I don't think it's just that. You know, the underlying problem, of course, is patriarchy, a system we don't name often enough. Institutionalized male dominance. Now, that's a reality of the lives of women around the world. Patriarchy takes different forms in different places. If you go to Afghanistan, it looks different than it does in the United States, of course. But I think that the problem is, in that sense, worldwide. And until we start talking about patriarchy and the problem of institutionalized male violence, I don't think we're going to make much progress. Now, funding is often a problem. In the United States, for instance, rape crisis centers made advances over the last 40 years, but are sort of systematically being underfunded now. Again, in other countries, the problem is more dramatic. But until we can talk honestly about patriarchy and then, of course, a feminist response to it, I don't think we're going to make that much progress either here or abroad.
And finally, Republicans are scrambling to reverse their position on the Confederate flag, which most people see as a symbol of the U.S.'s racist past, but which conservatives often refer to as the rebel flag. In the wake of the Charleston terror attack, there has been a huge public outcry over the flags being flown outside the South Carolina State House and in a number of other southern states. Now, South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley has reversed her position on the flag, saying yesterday in a press conference that she supported taking down the, quote, deeply offensive symbol of a brutally offensive past. The New York Times speculated that, quote, the flag would inevitably complicate Haley's selection as a cabinet member or even vice presidential nominee if she wanted either. Meanwhile, the state of Mississippi is also considering changing its flag, which actually encompasses the Confederate flag in its design. Bob, do these stories represent a symbolic victory for racial justice?
Symbolic, although it seems rather thin. I mean, the fact that in 2015 we're still talking about the Confederate battle flag is a little sad. It would be as if Germany was still talking about whether the swastika was an appropriate symbol to honor the sacrifice of German veterans in World War II. In that case, you can't imagine it. It would be, morally unthinkable. But it's an analogous situation. Nazi comparisons are often overdrawn, but in this case, it's dead on. And the fact that it took this mass murder to even put the issue on the agenda of Republican politicians in South Carolina and around the country is really, really quite sad. And of course, this is not limited to South Carolina. On my own campus, the University of Texas at Austin, we still have statues to Jefferson Davis and other Confederates that the university seems to be
about the Charleston terror attack. I want to thank you so much, Bob, as always, for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Bob Jensen is an author. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A special commission on last summer's brutal Israeli war on the Gaza Strip has submitted a scathing report to the United Nations Human Rights Council. The report, released on Monday in Geneva, was authored by Mary McGowan Davis. McGowan Davis is a former New York Supreme Court judge. The report points out that Israel violated international law in its air and ground operations during the 51-day war, and that Palestinian armed groups flouted a law in relying on indiscriminate rockets launched at Israel. Of course, Israel, which refused to cooperate with investigators, carried out the overwhelming bulk of attacks on Gaza's civilian population, killing far greater numbers of people than groups like Hamas did. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu immediately denounced the report, saying, quote, "It is biased. The commission that wrote it is under a committee that does everything but protect human rights." An ongoing war crimes inquiry by the International Criminal Court is expected to include this report. Meanwhile, Israel released its own report last week, completely absolving itself of wrongdoing. My guest is Jennifer Loewenstein. She's a faculty associate in Middle East Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome to Uprising, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what do you make of the fact that the report seemed to condemn Palestinian armed groups and their resistance efforts almost as much as Israeli war crimes?
I believe I know why they did that. I think it was an attempt by the people who were working on the commission to show even-handedness to the Israelis. They didn't want to be perceived as focusing only on Israel. But in my view, it was a mistake to do that because Israel and Hamas are not equal parties to the conflict. What we're talking about would be analogous to comparing slave uprisings and the white crackdown um, on slaves as somehow equal. That wouldn't absolve anyone in a slave population from committing an atrocity. People would understand that. But at the same time, we're not talking about equal parties in a conflict. We're talking about one people that is under occupation, that is living under unbelievably terrible circumstances, and another population that has Palestinians captive,
Right.
that keeps them captive. And I think people have to remember that this is not a conflict between equals.
Now, certainly Hamas has come under fire, and I think legitimately so, for executing suspected collaborators. Again, that's
Yes.
Palestinians being killed, by the way. But do we have any comparison for how many Israelis were killed in that 51-day war compared to Palestinians? How many Israelis were killed by Hamas's rocket attacks, for example?
Six Israeli civilians were killed, and something like 69 soldiers. So, in other words, within the laws of war, the proportion of Israeli soldiers killed, military targets, was acceptable.
Hmm.
In the Gaza Strip, where between 65 and 75% of the victims were civilians, that is not acceptable. And most of the report's findings showed, in my view, that the Israeli military did not adhere to international humanitarian law or international law, and indiscriminately fired on densely populated areas, killing civilians in scores of civilians, and I believe very often deliberately.
Now, the report's authors interviewed many survivors in Gaza of the bombings. What sort of patterns were observed in this report? Was it obvious that Israel was sort of indiscriminate at best, but targeting civilians at worst? I mean, did it point to some kind of pattern of how Israel conducted this war?
Well, it did in the sense that, first of all, you have to understand there were over 6,000 aerial strikes on the Gaza Strip during this period of time, early July to August, I believe, 26th. And the pattern was that the airstrikes in the initial few days of the war were clearly causing a very high number of civilian casualties. And this was known by the Israeli military. They could tell that civilians were being killed. And that did not change their strategy. In other words, they continued throughout the war attacking civilian homes, civilian buildings, such as, or protected areas, such as hospitals, schools, shelters, United Nations buildings, which are completely off limits in any conflict. Um, this didn't stop throughout the war, if you can call it a war. I don't think of it as a war because, as I said earlier, it was not a conflict, and it is not a conflict between equals.
What about the use of so-called warnings that Israel reportedly offered to Gazans to evacuate their homes minutes before being bombed? Israel offered this as a gesture of humanitarianism, but of course the international community, many activists denounced it as simply creating more panic and terror. How did the report view this?
As similarly, I mean, the report was worded very carefully, I thought, and in fact, too carefully for my own taste. But you know, the so-called roof knock tactic, where a family in a residential home will be sitting around, and a small rocket will be fired through the roof. And this is an indication to them that they have to get out of the house because within a certain amount of time, the house is going to be blown up. A lot of times people in these families don't know that. They don't realize that this is a warning of what's going to come. But as you said, there are these other reasons. People in the Gaza Strip don't have any place to go to. The Gaza Strip is the most densely populated area of land in the world, and you can't escape it. The population is imprisoned there. They can't leave. So when somebody gets a roof knock or a leaflet saying to get out of the area, most people don't know where to go. There are airstrikes all around. There is destruction in every direction you look. And it does create a sense of terrible panic and fear among the population. And it caused many people to stay at home because they felt that was the place they knew. They could possibly hide in a corner of the house. I don't know what people were thinking, except that they were very confused and obviously did not understand in many cases that they were supposed to get out, and that in some cases they had seconds to do so.
All right, I mean, we all ought to put ourselves in that same position and imagine what would we do if we got such a warning while we were in our own homes, a place that we're supposed to feel safe. Among the incidents that were investigated was the killing of 4 Palestinian boys, all cousins, when they were playing on the beach in Gaza. And Israel reported that it investigated itself last week and said it was an unfortunate incident. However, the Israeli soldiers were not to blame for mistaking these little boys as Hamas's Navy men. What did the UN report conclude on that? And also in general, how does the report view the Israeli war as it targeted and impacted children, Palestinian children? I believe 500 Palestinian children killed, among them 4 of them those boys on the beach.
Yes. Well, we have to remember again that in this there were Israeli commanders basically stating very openly to the public that everyone in Gaza is an enemy. Once a war starts, we're not talking about civilians versus combatants. The soldiers are facing not a civilian population any longer, but an enemy population. I think this accounts for not only the last conflict, Operation Protective Edge, but it also accounts for the activities of the Israeli forces in Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 2009. Anybody in the Gaza Strip, in the mindset of Israeli military leaders, is considered a combatant, is considered an enemy. And this for me accounts for the complete indifference of the Israeli military to the lives of women and children, as well as men who are not involved in the military in any way. When you treat a population like that, you are dehumanizing them and what happens is nobody's a civilian, so everybody is a legitimate target.
Right.
That is a very dangerous way for people to think.
Now, even though we think of Gaza as not technically being occupied by Israel anymore because of the settlements being dismantled a few years ago, the UN Commission report says something quite important about it. It says, quote, Israel has maintained effective control of the Gaza Strip within the meaning of Article 42 of the 1907 Hague regulations. The assessment that Gaza continues to be occupied by Israel is shared by the international community, as articulated by the General Assembly, has been reaffirmed by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. How significant is this assessment that effectively Gaza remains occupied by Israel even if there aren't actual settlements?
It's very significant because the lives and futures of people in Gaza are completely beholden to Israel. Israel controls Gaza by land, by sea, by air. It controls the food supply, it controls the water supply, and it controls, to a great extent, who can and cannot leave the Gaza Strip. Egypt does have a role there, but it's much smaller than Israel's role in controlling and patrolling and monitoring the borders of the Gaza Strip. I don't see how anyone can call the Gaza Strip anything but an occupied territory, and worse, an open air prison, if not an open air poaching ground, where any person living there is a legitimate target for the Israeli military. This is a very sinister behavior on the part of Israel. It's also very ominous because this conflict is not anywhere near ending.
Now, Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, cited praise from U.S. and European generals as a counterpoint to the UN report. Doesn't that right away sort of point out clearly how the U.S. and Europe provide cover for Israeli crimes? I mean, Netanyahu can simply say, well, we'll dismiss this UN report because the U.S. and Europe are behind me.
Oh, I mean, to me, this is just incredible. I think the European Union is, personally, I think it is a very cowardly body because it seems to want to fall in line with the Americans every time there's an American statement about this. As far as the Americans go, we've seen decades of U.S. foreign policy in which Israel is unconditionally pardoned for repeated war crimes, terrible war crimes, whether it's in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or up in Lebanon, where some of the most atrocious actions of the Israeli military have taken place over the last 5 or 6 decades. I could spend a long time trying to explain why this is so, but the fact is, when the U.S. objects to anything that Israel does, it is meaningless because behind their objections are no actions.
Right.
They are not taking any action to stop funding. They're not taking any action to stop the building of settlements, to stop the influx and the growth of these settlement neighborhoods, which are in fact more settlements. If the United States is unwilling to act, it is supporting Israel's behavior militarily, politically, economically, and those policies have a very deleterious effect on the lives and, as I said, the futures of Palestinian people.
Well, Jennifer, let's talk about what this report could actually do. I mean, it's great to actually document these horrific war crimes. Earlier wars that Israel conducted on Gaza have also been documented and reported by the United Nations. I understand that this report is going to be used in an ICC inquiry, International Criminal Court inquiry into Israel's war crimes. But Israel is not party to the Rome Statute that created the court. So is this a toothless inquiry?
I don't think so, because I have been involved in human rights activism for more than 3 decades, and in particular, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as it's called. And there have been changes in the attitude of the American public. They're not major changes. I don't want to overstate it, but people are starting to question what's going on there. The Middle East is in the news so often, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in the news so often, that I think some of the activist work, and I think also the actions of Israel itself, many of which are caught on tape and are reported by very brave journalists, these are starting to filter down into the public of the United States and into the publics of Europe. So whether or not Israel is a signatory to the Rome Statute, it's a shame that it's not, but I don't see this report as being meaningless. I think at some point it will stand along with the last report on Israel's war or attack in Gaza as more evidence of what a terribly barbaric and inhumane regime Israel has over the its captive Palestinian population.
And I should mention that there is a boat full of journalists and activists heading toward Gaza right now, Freedom Flotilla number 3, that are attempting to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza by sea, and they are hoping that this report will provide some protection as it shines an international spotlight onto what Israel is doing. Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your analysis with us.
Thank you very much. I wish the best to the journalists, but I have to say I'm quite worried about them.
Yeah, certainly those previous boats have been attacked. Jennifer Loewenstein is a faculty associate in Middle East Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And speaking of Gaza, by the way, journalist Max Blumenthal is heading to California. And for our audiences in the Bay Area, he's going to be speaking July 1st about his book, The 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza. That is happening July 1st at 7:30 p.m. at the First Congregational Church, 2345 Channing in Berkeley. And then he heads to Southern California a few days later for an event sponsored by Uprising and KPFK. I'll be interviewing Max on stage at the First Congregational Church as well, but the one in Los Angeles. That's July 7th at 7 p.m. That's at 540 South Commonwealth Avenue in LA. You can check out the websites of either station, whichever one you listen to get tickets. For the Bay Area event July 1st, check out kpfa.org to get tickets. For the Southern California event, July 7th, check out kpfk.org to get tickets. Tickets are very limited, and we hope you'll join us. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The issue of national security is constantly invoked by politicians and the media as justifications for war and surveillance. Since the September 11th attacks, the U.S. has launched endless wars that have ironically made us less safe and built an unprecedented network of intrusive surveillance. Today, as part one of a series of interviews that I did with a number of experts, journalists, authors, and academics, we'll explore what the U.S.'s national security policies have really amounted to. The interviews were produced by Brave New Films, which is headed by the acclaimed filmmaker Robert Greenwald. They're called the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. Henry A. Wallace was the 33rd Vice President of the United States, served under Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II, and he ran for the presidency on the Progressive Party ticket in 1948. He was an agriculturalist, an economist, author, and businessman. Mr. Wallace was known as the champion of the common man in the struggle against the moneyed elites for control of government and the planet's resources. On today's episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we'll present my interview with Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald brought us the Snowden revelations about the national security state. But secrecy is a bigger problem than one whistleblower and one agency. How does secrecy threaten democracy itself? Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Perhaps no one has stirred the pot more on the reach of the national security state than journalist Glenn Greenwald when he released information provided by whistleblower Edward Snowden. Americans learned that the NSA was spying on everyone and even sharing that data with other agencies like the DEA. What we want to explore today is not just the programs at the NSA, but how and why secretive programs undermine our democracy. Joining me now is Glenn Greenwald. Welcome to the program, Glenn.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So the NSA claims that they are collecting all of this data on all of us with the mandate to keep us all safer. But are they actually accomplishing that?
Not at all. I mean, if you look at the successful terrorist attacks like the one that was carried out at the Boston Marathon, it's almost impossible to find any evidence of these NSA programs actually stopping any terror plots. And if you look even going back all the way 10 years ago to the 9/11 Commission, what they concluded about why the US government failed to stop the 9/11 attack was not because they had failed to collect enough intelligence. Quite the contrary. They said that the government had collected more than enough intelligence to be able to know the attack was coming, but that they had so much in their possession that they failed to proverbially connect the dots to know what it is that they had. And their solution, or their response to that conclusion, was to simply try and collect more. In fact, in the words of the NSA documents, their goal was to collect it all, to collect the entire internet. And as you suggest, when you're collecting everything, it's almost impossible to find the things they claim they're looking for, which are people who are planning terrorist attacks or other violent crime.
Now, it's quite widely known that the NSA stores all of the massive amounts of data that it collects in certain data centers, for example, in Utah. But doesn't that, just the fact that it's all sitting there in this central location or in a number of central locations, doesn't it result in a risk, particularly in terms of cybersecurity and the threats that these sorts of data centers might be under?
It's a really good point, actually, and one that's often overlooked. You know, Edward Snowden was just a single individual who didn't even work for the NSA. He actually worked for an outside contractor, Booz Allen Hamilton, and yet he had access to extraordinary amounts of information. And there are millions of people, literally, with top secret access and clearance inside the US government. Just that alone poses a huge threat. But it's not just the insider threats, as you suggest, it's also foreign governments, adversary governments, it's stateless groups, it's hackers. When you take that amount of sensitive information, namely our communications and the communications of people around the world, and digitally store them in one place, you absolutely inherently are vulnerable to attack, and it can be a massive invasion of people's privacy on all kinds of levels.
Now, Glenn, are there economic costs associated with the national security state, with what the NSA is doing? And is there, do you have a sense of how far the NSA is willing to go to pay a price under the auspices of national security?
Well, there's an enormous price just in terms of the budget. You know, people like to make the point that Russia and China and Iran and every other country essentially on the planet engages in electronic surveillance, and that's true, but nobody does it near to the extent of the United States, and that's just simply a question of resources. We spend so much more on the NSA or electronic surveillance than any other country by far, billions and billions of dollars a year. So that right there is an enormous cost. But then there's the cost of when people find out that this spying is taking place, people will no longer trust the American tech sector.
Now, here in the United States, the NSA justifies its spying, saying they're essentially protecting the country from those who are doing something wrong, people who have something to hide, the bad folks. And we know historically, for example, the FBI spied on civil rights activists, on Martin Luther King Jr. And today on anti-war activists and environmentalists, we see this continuing as if these are people who are doing something wrong. How do you respond to that?
There's 2 points worth making about that. Number one is when we talk about somebody doing something wrong, many different people mean very different things when they talk about someone doing something wrong. We might mean somebody who's planning an attack to blow up a building or a subway train and kill lots of civilians, but people in power tend to view anyone who challenges their power as doing something wrong. The other point worth making is that a surveillance state affects everybody, not just the people who are, quote, doing anything wrong, whatever we might mean by that. Just the knowledge that you might be watched or monitored means that you change your behavior in all kinds of ways. There are all kinds of psychological studies showing that people become much more conformist and cautious and afraid. They make much more limited choices whenever they perceive that they might be monitored, as opposed to when they believe they can act without being watched. And so a surveillance society is really a conformist society, which is why almost every government craves surveillance.
Now, Glenn, does the NSA's approach to national security have the opposite effect, that citizens who might be afraid of landing up on a watch list might be more reluctant to actually report on real national security threats if they see something?
It has a deterrent effect in all kinds of ways. And that's one of the ironies is after 9/11, the US government believed that one of the critical objectives for being able to stop terrorism and to find extremists who are actually dangerous was to work closely and in collaboration with the Muslim American community and American Muslim leaders around the country. And yet everything the US government has done over the past 13 years has been designed to do the opposite, to break any trust, to make any kind of collaboration impossible. I mean, if a community knows that the government is spying on it pervasively, that they're infiltrating it, that they perceive it as a threat, all of which the US government has done, that if you say even a slightly wrong thing at one point about your political views, you could get onto a radar of the government or even a watch list or be accused of terrorism. No member of that community is going to want to cooperate in any way with the US government.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how the efforts to plant surveillance mechanisms within our technology may have actually made the internet a place that's much more susceptible to actually be attacked and create greater dangers?
We talk a lot in the wake of the Snowden revelations about encryption, the idea that you use certain means to protect your emails or your chats if you want to protect it from being monitored. But encryption is actually something that's extremely important to how the internet functions. Everybody uses encryption even though they don't know it. What the NSA has been doing is deliberately weakening those encryption protocols. They have been finding and exploiting flaws in them. They put backdoors in them to enable themselves to be able to break through the encryption in order to get into it. The problem is that when you create a backdoor, even if you're comfortable with having the NSA do it, and none of us should be, but even if you are, when you create a backdoor into a building or into a virtual building, it's not only you that gets to enter it, it's other people. So other governments, stateless groups, hackers who might be a lot more malicious even, are able to enter that as well, or just individuals with a high level of knowledge of how the internet works. And so it makes the entire system of encryption much weaker and therefore weakens the internet as a whole.
Glenn, how unprecedented is the reach of the NSA's surveillance state? Just if you look not only at US history, but world history, that this one institution is able to pry into the lives of people the world over. Has any institution ever come even close to what the NSA is doing?
The internet itself is an unprecedented tool. We do so much more on the internet and centralize so much more of our lives in one place than ever before. And if you think about what the explicit goal of the US government and their allies in this Five Eyes alliance are, the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, they explicitly say that their goal is to collect it all, to turn the internet into a place where there's literally no privacy, where every communication, every transaction, every activity is collected, stored, and then ultimately monitored when they want by these governments. And there's been nothing like the internet, and there's certainly been nothing like the level of surveillance that this kind of indiscriminate spying permits.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you so much.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
On the next episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, author Linda Bilmes joins us to talk about just how much money we're spending on war. It will shock you.
Pentagon budget, not counting the wars, has increased by about $1 trillion over the last decade. It is very, very difficult to actually look at the Defense Department budget. It actually has flunked its financial audit every year for the past 20 years. And it's the only department in the US government that routinely flunks its audit.
And that is the first installment of a series of interviews I did as part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum presented by Brave New Films. The next episode featuring Linda Bilmes on the financial costs of war will be aired on Thursday. This is Uprising. After this break, we'll turn to Mumia Abu Jamal. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Mumia Abu Jamal is an award-winning journalist and a political prisoner, and he just filed this commentary about the Charleston terror attack.
Charleston, a young white man, barely at the age of his majority, walks into Charleston's most storied black church, and before he leaves, a new history is written. Attending a Wednesday night Bible study, he sits for nearly an hour, but his mind isn't on the life of Jesus nor his disciples. It's on murder, mass murder. When the door shuts behind him, 9 black souls, elders mostly, had been slain, Bibles in hand. The man, more boy than man really, hadn't come to learn about religion, for he had a belief, white supremacy, or the profound hatred of black people. White supremacy is the mother's milk of Charleston, of South Carolina, of the South, of America. For surely as slavery funded and built America, the underlying principle was the devaluation, exploitation, and oppression of black life. It's the only thing that makes the church massacre in Charleston even remotely intelligible. 9 black people were sacrificed to the blind idol of white supremacy for the same reason that thousands of black men and women were lynched on American elms and pines, as sacrifices to an idea to perpetuate a system of economic injustice. Dylan Roof, the 21-year-old accused of this massacre, had no friends to speak of, no place to stay other than an associate's couch, no job, and a tenuous relationship with his parents. Isolated, alienated, alone in the world. His sole remaining possession was his whiteness, the only thing that gave his existence meaning. That was the energy that fueled the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina. It now sits like an incubus in the American soul, seething hatred and fear, waiting for more black lives to consume. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
Mumia Abu Jamal is an award-winning journalist and a political prisoner, and you can hear all of his commentaries online at prisonradio.org. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley has dramatically changed her tune on the controversial issue of the Confederate flag flying in front of the State House. In a press conference yesterday, she said, quote, "It's time to move the flag from the Capitol grounds. This is a moment in which we can say that the flag, while an integral part of our past, does not represent the future of our great state." Haley had defended the flag earlier in a bizarre and somewhat indecipherable statement about corporate CEOs not having a problem with the flag. The Confederate flag, which Charleston shooter Dylan Roof posed with in many photos on his website, has come under fire from activists since last Wednesday's harrowing terror attack. Among those organizing for its removal and for Black Lives to Matter are a growing number of white activists. In fact, thousands of people from multiple racial backgrounds gathered on Charleston's main bridge yesterday in a so-called unity march. Among them was comedian Stephen Colbert, a native of Charleston, organizing under the banner of Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURGE. White Americans are increasingly seeing themselves as part of the movement for racial justice, and one of them is my guest, Dara Silverman. She is the national coordinator of Showing Up for Racial Justice. Welcome to Uprising, Dara. Hi, Dara.
Welcome. I'm glad to be here.
First, tell us a little bit about SURGE. How long has it been around, and how is it organized? I understand that there are chapters in many cities and states.
Yes. SURGE was founded in 2009, really after President Obama was elected, and as there started to be an increase in attacks on people of color in leadership, on President Obama, and a rise in militias and in the white power movement. And a number of leaders of color and white leaders, particularly in the South, started to talk to each other, and particularly from the leaders of color, they were saying, where are the white people? Where are the white people speaking up and acting up against this? And so SURGE was formed. There was an initial petition that about 1,000 people signed on to. And for the past 5 years or so, we've been building up our chapter base. But really over the past 9 months is when there's been a huge growth. We've gone from about a dozen groups across the country created, and now we're working with over 80 groups.
Over
and
80
I imagine
groups?
in the next couple of weeks that will grow as well. Yes.
Now, how has Surge responded to the Charleston massacre? Were your members among those who demanded that the Confederate flag be pulled down and also showed up to the Unity March in Charleston?
Yes, our members actually organized. We're part of the organizing team that put together the Unity March in Charleston, and they're having another action today where they're going to be meeting on one of the town greens in Charleston and really being visible again as white people who are against both this attack and, you know, the ongoing system of oppression of people of color and Black people in Charleston, throughout the South, and throughout the country.
Dara, we're having some trouble hearing you. Maybe if you could try without your headphones, that might be better for us. Dara Silverman is the National Coordinator of Showing Up for Racial Justice. How important, Dara, is it for white Americans to join the struggle overall? I mean, certainly it's, if we look at the past, if we look at the civil rights movement in the United States historically, there were many whites who marched alongside Blacks. How important is it today?
You know, this movement is really a movement that is led by people of color, particularly working class, young, Black men and women and queer people. And so I think for us, it's really about supporting that movement that's out there and really naming for a broader white population that both this attack and these ongoing series of attacks have everything to do with race. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Great. So for us, it's really about now is the time to take action and collective responsibility for organizing white communities and really calling other white people in. There are just, you know, hundreds of white people, thousands who have joined us in the past week alone, who have said, I don't stand for what this system is. I don't stand with Dylan Roof and his racist attacks and the attacks on the church and the attacks that happen every day. You know, I live in a small town in upstate New York, and just yesterday, 2 young Black men were arrested in front of my office building. And it was another violent attack, and I was right there with them. And it was another moment of, you know, the humanity of Black people really being squashed by the state, by the police force, and, you know, in bigger areas, by an ongoing structure that's really about maintaining power for white people. And the biggest way one of the ways that is really necessary for that to change is for more white people to come out and say, yes, I don't believe in this, and that undoing institutional racism is our job.
And I should mention this week marks the 51st anniversary of the murders in Neshoba County, Mississippi, of a multiracial group of civil rights activists, James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. So people have spilled blood for racial justice in the past. Dylan Roof said to one of the survivors of the shooting, you rape our women. And by our women, of course, he meant white women. A white writer named Chloe Angel wrote an article yesterday in the New Republic, and she said, I don't want to be an excuse for racist violence anymore, white women's passive role in racist attacks like Charleston. How important is it for white women in particular to speak out like this writer has against the kind of patriarchal white supremacist thinking that Dylan seems to espouse and that many seem to?
You know, I think it's crucial for white women to speak out. You know, I think that article that you referenced is really key because it gets to the core that a lot of times the racist attacks that are done primarily by white men, most of these attacks that have happened in the United States where there have been mass shootings and massacres have been completed by white men, have been attempted by white men, have on communities of color. And that a lot of the excuse, I think Dylan Roof was more explicit in it, but a lot of the reason for it is this idea of preserving white womanhood. And this has been something that's been used for hundreds of years, going back to Emmett Till and so many instances in between then and now to maintain social control of Black communities and specifically of Black men. And so I think it's crucial for white people to really be both acknowledging the humanity of Black men and women and children, and then also it's not our response to police any of the responses that Black people have to these hateful actions, because we know that there's hundreds of years of trauma and anger and fear that are going to be coming out. And so really for Surge, and you can see more information about this on our website, we have a number of action kits and tools for people to use. We see our role as organizing other white people. We see our role as bringing other white people in and helping white people to identify what is our mutual interest, what is our stake in ending racism and ending white supremacy, and how can we call other white people into taking action.
Right, and it's not just as simple as showing up, though, because in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement breaking onto the national scene since last summer's death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, some well-meaning white folks would hold up signs saying all lives matter. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think the biggest thing that's wrong with that is that the reason that it's so necessary to say Black Lives Matter is because there are so many ways in our society that it is reinforced that Black lives don't matter, in terms of our education systems and the privatization of education, in terms of our healthcare system, in terms of housing and the redlining that's happened in communities of color where people aren't able to afford or buy houses outside of certain areas, in terms of the way that gentrification has moved into low-income communities and communities of color. There are so many ways in which we have structures that are set up to keep people of color, and specifically Black people, down. And anti-Black racism is really used as a crux to maintain power for white people and white communities. And so this is why it's even more necessary for white people to be speaking up, to support it, be supporting the Black Lives Movement, and to be engaging other white people in our churches, in our communities. You know, we have a ton of parents who are organizing, and I think that's what we're seeing, that there are more and more populations of white people who want to say, not my name. This is not the legacy that I want for my children or for us moving forward as a country.
Now, Dara, are there online resources that you can recommend for our audience who sincerely want to join the movement but might be worried that they might say and do the wrong thing? It can be a scary thing to be a white person fighting for racial justice because you're always battling with your own privilege, and at any time you worry that you might say or do something offensive that you may not even realize is offensive. And I think that holds a lot of people back.
Right. I mean, I think this is one of the biggest things that we really work on, again, with our folks, is that standing up and showing up for racial justice is a lifelong battle, a lifelong commitment. And it's sort of like one of those moving sidewalks at the airport. You know, we're moving towards white supremacy. We're moving towards racism. The only way to change that is not even just to turn around, but it's to walk and run in the other direction. And to do that, we need to bring a lot more people with us. And that a big part of that is that we need to take risks, right? So yesterday, out on the street in front of my office, I needed to try to intervene as much as I could and to support these young men who are getting arrested. And that's just one example of an unjust arrest for a stupid rule about trespassing in my town. But there are hundreds and thousands of examples that happen every day of the way that police unlawfully do stop and frisk. There are so many ways for people to take risks. So we have, like I said, about 80 groups across the country that meet, and many of them start out their meetings by saying, what did you do to show up for racial justice in the past since our last meeting? On our website, we have a number of toolkits for how to organize a house meeting, how to organize a rally, how to engage other people.
Dara, are you there? We just lost your audio and we are going to try to call you right back. Dara Silverman is the national coordinator for showing up for racial justice. So we're going to just try to get her on the phone. Unless you can hear me. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. We're going to try to get her on the phone. Do bear with us for the last few minutes of this very important conversation about how people can show up for racial justice, particularly white Americans, in solidarity with people of color and in particular African Americans. And of course, today, I mentioned earlier, today is the 51st anniversary of yesterday rather, was the 51st anniversary of the killings of James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, a multiracial group of activists who lost their lives for civil rights. Dara, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, so you were just saying that people gather at meetings and talk about what they did to show up for racial justice. Dara? And we lost you again, unfortunately. So we're going to try to call you back to get you in these last few minutes of our show, because I have one very important question left to ask of you. The website, by the way, is showingupforracialjustice.org, showingupforracialjustice.org, and that's the phone number of the the website of the organization. Dara, are you there? And we are trying to call you. There we go. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so my final question to you is, what about non-Black people of color? Dylan Roof cited the racism of Asians in his manifesto and saw them as allies of his, and of course, not all Asians are racist, but there is anti-Black racism in Asian populations. Look at Nikki Haley and Bobby Jindal being on the side of conservatives and at least temporarily supporting the Confederate flag. Is there room for non-Black people of color in SURJ as well?
You know, SURJ is really focused on how are we bringing more white people into this movement. But we work in partnership with groups like Asian for Black Lives and other communities that are organizing other non-Black people of color groups. Some of our groups are multiracial as well. You know, in places like Bellingham, Washington, where there isn't a huge population of people of color, it makes sense that all of the non-Black people of color and the white people are working together. So they just did a banner hang on Sunday night as a part of their vigil. And so some of our groups are multiracial or have people of color that are part of it. Our focus is really on how are we bringing more white people in.
And
there
finally,
was a great article.
Right, go ahead.
I would just point people to on Race File this morning about what Dylan Roof said about Asian people being racist as well, and it really dismantles it from a progressive Asian perspective.
Well, you know, as an Asian, I will admit that there certainly is a strain of anti-Black racism, as there is in many other communities, and we all have to fight that and face that. Finally, and very briefly, Dara Silverman, did the Rachel Dolezal incident make it harder for white allies to work for racial justice?
You know, a woman named Allie Michaels had a great piece about how, you know, for a lot of white people, when they start to acknowledge that we live in a racist world and that as white people we're benefiting from it, they have a hard time. And sometimes white people want to distance themselves from other white people.
Right.
You know, they want to only be with people who share their perspective, whether that's people of color or white people. And that's something that we see that's very common. And so I was mentioning earlier about the need for white people to take risks. We know in that white people are going to make mistakes, and that we have to learn from them. And like you said, we can't always see all the ways in which we've taken in racist values. And so a really important part of SURJ and all of our local groups, and there are a lot of resources on our website.
And I'll give that website out again. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Showingupforracialjustice.org is the website. Dara Silverman is my guest. She's the national coordinator of the organization. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our research intern and our audio engineer with help from Federico Garcia. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Our YouTube channel is at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.